côté, 1. En arrière, 2, 3. Cha, cha. 1. En avant, 2, 3. Cha, cha. 1. En arrière, 2, 3. Cha, cha. 1.
One of the things that I find interesting about Đào Duy Anh is to look at where his ideas came from. Living in French Indochina, of course, he was influenced by ideas that French scholars were publishing. But one thing that's interesting is that as someone who could read Chinese, he was also very influenced by writings that were coming from China. And we can see this in one of his first books, a book called An Outline of Vietnamese Culture. Đào Duy Anh begins this book with a preface in which he says that he's basing the structure of his book on some ideas about culture that a French scholar by the name of Félix Sartiot had written about. However, when you look at what he says about Sartiot, it doesn't really fit his structure of his book. If you look, however, at one of the books he cites later in his work, in his list of his bibliography or of works consulted, there's a work there by a Chinese scholar by the name of Yang Dongchun, who also wrote a book called An Outline of Chinese Culture, and he wrote it almost a decade before, or say 7 years before Đào Duy Anh wrote his book, and it is structured exactly like Đào Duy Anh's book. What is more, even the opening passage, if you read the two books, they are almost word for word the same. So I say this not to put down Đào Duy Anh or to say that he was plagiarizing or anything like that, because if you look at the information in Đào Duy Anh's book, there's a lot there that is different, even though he's presenting his information in the same way that Yang Dongchun presented his information. But the important point, I think, is just to say that there was this connection between intellectuals like Đào Duy Anh in the 1920s and 30s with intellectuals in China. This is something we don't usually think about when people write about modern Vietnamese history. Everyone knows that in the pre-modern times, there was a deep connection between the educated elite in Vietnam and the world of ideas and the culture of the elite in the various dynasties of China. Everyone knows that in the early 20th century, people like Phan Bội Châu were influenced by the ideas of people like Liang Qichao, these reformers in late Qing China. But then after that, it's as if China just vanished from the Vietnamese world and there was no connection anymore. And then in the 40s, we find writings of people like Zheng Jin, this cultural theorist for the communist movement who started to write about culture and was clearly influenced by Maoist ideas. But in the 1920s and 30s, it's as if there was just no connection anymore with the Chinese world. That's obviously not the case, as there were many people in Vietnam who still read and wrote Chinese and were more comfortable in that language than they were in French. Đào Duy Anh was one such person, and he read extensively the scholarship that was coming out of China, all of which was just as modern as the French scholarship that was being published by French scholars, as the Chinese were reading works that were coming from Europe and they were adapting those and transforming their understanding of their own society, which to someone like Đào Duy Anh was very similar to Vietnamese society, and he therefore was very indebted to and learned a lot from the pioneering work of Chinese scholars. At the same time, however, he also read extensively of what the French were writing, and that's what we'll look at in the next video.